we believe that the festivals of the Bible symbolize God's plan for man, His plan of salvation as it's been worked out through history, down through time. And we also believe that it is a matter of prophecy for the future. We have tended to think of it mostly in terms of the future as Christians. We look at the Christian typology, we look at the festivals in some sense, of course, though, to see where we have been and to see where we are going. The word that I oftentimes use for this discussion of the festivals is the word typology. It basically means a study of the Old Testament and New Testament types. Types are models or images. It has to do with, perhaps a more familiar word, the symbolism of the holy days. The types in prophecy are the images of things. Antitype is the latter end time fulfillment or the reality of these things. And so we have had, over quite a long period of time, an ongoing discussion and study of the typology of the holy days in the Bible. Generally, we have had a fairly set typology of the holy days. It is, for the most part, as I said, forward-looking. It's totally Christian in its outlook. And unfortunately, I think we have tended at times to overlook the dual nature of the holy days, that is, the dual nature of the typology or symbolism of the holy days. They have what I call a Jewish historical typology on the one hand, and a Christian prophetic typology on the other. In other words, when you look at a given holy day, take Passover as a case in point. To a Jew, the Passover is a festival of freedom. It symbolizes almost entirely their deliverance out of Egypt. The days of unleavened bread have a historical connection in that the reason they eat unleavened bread 7 days is because their fathers took their bread in their kneading troughs without waiting for it to rise, and they hit the road and they cooked their bread without waiting for it to rise, so they ate flat bread. Consequently, the days of unleavened bread and the Passover all look back to the Exodus and the departure out of Egypt. Pentecost has a historical significance in that it was on the 6th of Sivan that the Ten Commandments were given. And oddly enough, with the Jews, the primary symbolism of Pentecost is the giving of the law. The secondary symbolism of Pentecost is the Feast of First Fruits. The problem is that we've dealt with it for a long time, is whether or not Pentecost should be on the 6th of Sivan or whether it should be on the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, as you count down from the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. That is the symbolism, or that is the time set by the commandment for the Feast of First Fruits. There is no commandment for the observance of the day of giving of the law. But the coincidence between Sivan 6th and the day in which the first fruits would normally be kept is so tight that among Jews, of course, because the giving of the law is the first symbolism for them, they keep it on the 6th of Sivan. So the historical is all important. But when you come to us as Christians, when we look at it, we see the Passover, Christ our Passover, is sacrificed for us, and He is the Passover Lamb. And He, through His sacrifice, puts sin out of our lives. Leavening is a type of sin. And we eat unleavened bread for 7 days, symbolizing the life that is free from sin, and all of the things that are connected with that. So we have our own set of Christological, if I may use that word, symbols. That is, symbols that have to do with the Christ, with His work, His ministry, His salvation that we attach to all these festivals. The Jews, on the other hand, have their historical set of symbols that they attach to all of these holy days. And so consequently, as I said before, we have a habit of looking at even the Old Testament symbolism in terms of the New Testament revelation that we've got and the Christological symbolism, the symbolism of Christ and seeing Christ in all of the holy days, which we do. And we see Him, His work, His ministry, and what all there is to know about Jesus Christ in the festivals that we find in the Bible. But now, if you were a Jew and you looked at these things, you might see things in, as I said earlier, rather a different light. 5 of these holy days are firmly connected to events in Israel's history. They are the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Now, Tabernacles, as everybody knows, in a Jewish historical sense, everyone who is Israelite born shall live in tabernacles or booths for 7 days so that you will remember that I made you dwell in booths when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. So for the Jew, the historical Jewish significance of the Feast of Tabernacles is also the Exodus. It's amazing, nearly everything circulates around the Exodus, the wilderness wanderings, and all the things connected with that in all of the historical typology and the memorials, as it were, of these days. But there are two holy days that have nothing, really no place in Israel's history. They don't point to anything in history. They don't point to anything having to do with the Exodus or with their subsequent history, for that matter. And those holy days are the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement. Consequently, the Old Testament study of these days has pretty well got to be prophetic and not historical. But the problem is that the Old Testament is extremely sparse as far as any kind of teaching relative to what the Feast of Trumpets is all about, or the Day of Atonement for that matter. There's considerably more about the Day of Atonement because of the elaborate ceremony that's connected with that day. So you've got something that, even though it's not historical, you've got something pretty firm to latch onto with the Day of Atonement. The problem, though, is that when you take a look at the Feast of Trumpets, it's much more difficult to do that. We actually, as I say, go to the New Testament for our explanation of these meanings. But if you just sort of look at this and say, okay, if I were a Jew before Christ, let's say we're dealing with that generation just before the coming of the Messiah, what would I have seen? What would I have anticipated? What would have been the things that came to my mind when we talk about trumpets, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Trumpets that took place every year throughout my life? Well, for them, it is Rosh Hashanah, which basically means the beginning of the year. It's a new year. It's the Jewish New Year to them. And so they don't look exactly for symbolism connected with the day very much. It's the New Year. We observe New Year ourselves with fireworks and parties and drinking too much, getting drunk and throwing up, as we joke and say, but parties, and we stay up until midnight, and we celebrate the coming in of the New Year. It has no symbolism, has no special meaning connected with it. We don't even look for that. And I suspect for the most part that is also true of Jewish people as they observe Rosh Hashanah. Well, if you go back to Leviticus 23, in verse 23, here's the commandment for the observance of this festival. Now, this is where we always go. Most sermons that talk about the meaning of the day start with Leviticus 23, because here is where the day is all laid out together. And in most cases, the meaning of the day, the connections of the day, are laid out right along with it. But unfortunately, not with this one. Speak unto the children of Israel in the 7th month and the 1st day of the month shall you have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein, but you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. Now, does anybody know the Hebrew word for trumpets in this passage? Anybody know it? No? There is no word for trumpets in this passage. That is frankly one of the most surprising things about this passage of Scripture. There is no word for trumpets in it. What you do have, however, is the word for blowing. What this really says is, in the 7th month, the 1st day of the month shall you have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing. Now, it's implicit that you're blowing on horns of some kind. That's the idea. The Hebrew word for blowing is teruah. I think it's probably an example of onomatopoeia. Now, do you know what that is? Basically, it is where the word actually imitates the sound of whatever it is that you're trying to talk about. For example, how many of you have in your house a to-do-to-do? None of you? Oh, yeah, you do. Every one of you have a to-do-to-do in your house. You don't know what it is? It's that little round piece of cardboard, little cylinder of cardboard in the middle of a roll of toilet paper. The reason why it's a to-do-to-do, because all the kids, they grab it and they go around going, to-do-to-do. Now you know what we're talking about, right? So how many of you have one of those in your house? There you go. At least that many will own up to it at the present time. I don't know what the rest of you are doing. But anyway, that's an example of onomatopoeia. We give a name to something that sounds like what it is. And you can sort of almost hear teruah in the idea of a trumpet. You've heard them go wah-wah, when they put the little thing over it in the big bands on the trombones and the trumpets, and they make that wah sound that comes out of the things. I think what you've got here, when it says you're going to have a memorial of blowing. And it's implicit, of course, that it is some form of a horn that they are actually blowing. But this thing of some of the discussions that we have about, let's say, the Feast of Trumpets, and people who will go charging through the Old Testament doing their word studies, well, trumpet means this, and that, and so forth. It's really an interesting illustration of the kind of problems we make for ourselves when we study the Bible, because we try to assume that Hebrew words are absolutely inelastic, and they always mean exactly the same thing no matter where you find them. And then you come across something like this, and you're trying to establish a meaning for the Feast of Trumpets, and all of a sudden you find out there ain't no word there. That word isn't there. And so the idea of trying to build some kind of a theology or a typology around trumpets is a little bit limiting right off the bat. But I still think it's worth considering. It's worth thinking about, because implicit, as I said before, in the fact that this is a festival of blowing, it's almost like it's a festival of trumpeting, as it were, without necessarily making a big deal out of what kind of trumpet it is. The idea of blowing on a wind instrument is surely intended. And the way it's worded may leave room for whatever it is that you have to blow on. Now, what did they use for blowing in those days? Everybody knows about the shofar, because a minute ago when I asked you and said, what was the Hebrew word here for trumpet, I heard mutterings around the audience of shofar. That's what it is. And everybody knows about the shofar because of the movie The Ten Commandments. There's this great scene in the Ten Commandments where the guy gets up there with his big old ram horn and gives this great blast on the trumpet. It has a unique sound, doesn't it? The sound of the shofar as people blow it. Where was I recently? In a conference last December where somebody was going to have the blowing of the shofar, and unfortunately it did not sound at all like the one I heard in the movie The Ten Commandments. I think he needed a little practice on the thing. It sounded like somebody spitting through a horn more than anything else. What's interesting about this, though, is that the sound of the shofar is, in the Hebrew, the sound that you make on the shofar is called yobel. And I have a feeling, again, if you were able to pronounce it in Hebrew, that it probably is, again, an example of trying to say with a sound what the instrument actually does. Now, there's an interesting little passage, though. First of all, we know about the ram's horn, and the sound that it makes is called yobel. The Lord spoke to Moses. This is now Numbers 10 in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses saying this, make you 2 trumpets of silver. Now, I guess in a biblical epic like the Ten Commandments, the shofar is better, but of course it's also appropriate for the most part, as we'll discuss a little bit later. But he says, first of all, make you 2 trumpets of silver. Of a whole piece shall you make them, that you may use them for the calling of the assembly and for the journeying of the camps. I can see a certain advantage also, from what I have heard of a shofar and what I have heard of a silver trumpet like that. Probably the silver trumpet is a higher pitched, more piercing, rattling off the rocks wherever they were camped. They might hear it further, and might have been more practical for some things than with the shofar. But one of the things that was critical about this is that the blowing of a trumpet was a kind of symbol for people. It was a message. It had meaning. Now, everyone knows what taps sounds like, don't we? I mean, we have heard it in enough funerals over the years that the sound of taps, that beautiful, haunting melody, I mean, it really touches me to the core of my being every time I hear it. Because all my months and months, and it seemed like eternity almost, in boot camp, every night we would be in that bed, all the lights are out, it goes quiet, and then across the camp comes the sound of taps. And you get that sound, very deep in your psyche. And there's something very special about it when you go to a funeral of a man who has been in the military, and they play the sound of taps following the gun salute, if my memory serves. You do the salute of the guns first, rifle salute first, and then immediately following it, as the sound of the rifles are echoing away, comes the sound of taps wafting across the cemetery. Very rare for me to even make that through that with a dry eye. So we all know that. But if you have also been in the military, you've picked up on a few other things. There are other calls that are done with the trumpet, or with the bugle, actually. There are as to the colors, which is very recognizable to all of us. Reveille, which hardly anyone, could not know who came through World War II and heard some of the songs like, I can't get 'em up, I can't get 'em up, I can't get 'em up in the morning. So we all know what reveille sounds like. And, of course, chow call. Chow call, that was the one that all of us knew for sure, because that means you could go line up and make your way down to the mess hall and get lunch or supper or breakfast, as the case may be. So chow call, to the colors, there are many different things that even the modern military, you learn as you come through boot camp, and these things echo through your mind throughout much of your life. Well, Israel needed some means of communication across the camp, and so consequently these silver trumpets were designed to be the official sound. Almost anybody might have had a ram's horn, right? Anybody could have faked a call with a ram's horn. Anybody could have got up and blown his ram's horn anytime he wanted to. But not everybody was going to have these silver trumpets. They were very distinct, they had very specific calls, and the people would know what they meant. It's interesting that in the New Testament, in the chapter of 1 Corinthians 14, where Paul is talking about speaking in tongues, he says, that even a trumpet, if it gives an uncertain sound, no one will know what is being sounded. You won't know what it is that you are supposed to do when the trumpet sounds. So even at that time, the trumpet and the sounding of the trumpet and the meaning of the melody played by the trumpet was known to these people, and it was a meaningful illustration for him to use. Well, they were to make 2 trumpets of silver, and when they were blew with them, all the assembly was to assemble themselves together with him at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And if they blow with but 1 trumpet, then the princes, who are the heads of the thousands of Israel, shall gather themselves to you. In other words, 1 trumpet, and the implication, I think, of the Hebrew here is that if there's 1 long, loud blast of 1 horn, then the princes are to come together. When you blow an alarm, then the camps on the east part shall go forward. When you blow an alarm the second time, the camps that are on the south side shall make the journey, and they shall blow an alarm for their journeys. In other words, what he is saying is simply this, that there is a call on the trumpet that is an alarm. I gather from some of the reading I've done that this is a kind of a staccato or repetitive type of call. The call for the princes to assembly was a long, loud blast on the trumpet. A shorter, repetitive staccato call was the one that was what they would call an alarm. The first alarm meant the camps on the east move forward. The second time they do it, the camps on the south move forward. And so that there was a symbolism, a system established that when they heard this, everyone knew what they were supposed to do. Very important in a day when nobody's got a public address system or email or anything to send messages around to a very, very large body of people who have to know what it is they're going to do. Well, he continues to say, the sons of Aaron, but when the congregation is to be gathered together, you shall blow, but you don't sound an alarm. In other words, you have a big blast on the trumpet that is for the congregation, but it's not the staccato alarm type. And the sons of Aaron, the priests, shall blow with the trumpet. They shall be to you an ordinance forever throughout your generation. Not everybody was supposed to be able to do this. It was the priests, the sons of Aaron, who were the ones who were allowed to blow on the trumpet. If you go to war in your land against the enemy that oppresses you, then you shall blow an alarm with the trumpets, and you shall be remembered before the Lord your God, and you shall be saved from your enemies. Also, in the day of your gladness, in your solemn days, in the beginnings of your months, you shall blow with the trumpet over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, so they may be to you for a memorial before the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God. In the day of your gladness and in your solemn days. So, a feast that is a celebration, a feast that is a solemn day, on every single one of those occasions, the silver trumpet was to be blown. And on the solemn days, on the days of sadness, the times of war, in fact, when there was a burnt offering being made on those days, and also at the beginning of every month, the silver trumpet was to be blown, signifying this is a new moon, this is the day of the new month. Now, what is also interesting about this is that as you make your way down from the first month of the year, the month of the Passover, the trumpet is blown on the first day of that month. The trumpet is blown on the first day of every month for the first 6 months. And the Feast of Trumpets, that's day after tomorrow, is the 7th month and the 7th trumpet of the year. Now, I'm not going to go into that today, But if you've read your New Testament, you know that the resurrection of the saints takes place at the last trumpet. You also know from the book of Revelation that there are 7 trumpets that are to be blown. But we don't know that if all we're reading is the Old Testament. All we know is the blowing of the trumpet in every new moon of the year, and we come down to this very special day. This is the 7th of the trumpets that are blown on the new moon throughout the year. Now, mind you, all this was done with the silver trumpets, not the ram's horn shofar. Now, down through history, and through all of Israel's history, trumpets of one kind or another took on great significance to Israel. For example, there's an occasion later, I believe this is, I neglected to get my reference on this, but anyway, we can look it up a little later. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites." I think this is probably Deuteronomy 31:1, I'm not sure. Afterward you shall be gathered, avenge the children of Israel on the Midianites, afterward you shall be gathered to your people. And Moses spoke to some of the people, "Arm some of yourselves unto the war, and let them go against the Midianites, and avenge the Lord of Midian." Is it Deuteronomy 31? No? Numbers 31 probably then. Try that one. Again, go against the Midianites, and avenge the Lord of Midian. Of every tribe 1,000 throughout all the tribes of Israel shall you send to the war. So there were delivered out of the thousands of Israel 1,000 of every tribe. There were 12,000 armed for the war, 1,000 of every tribe. Moses sent them to war, them and Phinehas the son of Eleazar the priest, to the war, with the holy instruments and the silver trumpets to blow in his hand. So, consequently, there is here and there is in the prophets the idea of war connected with trumpets. They are, for the most part, an alarm of war. As they were traveling in the wilderness, they were used as a symbol to break camp, set up camp, begin the camp to move, and so forth. But once they're in the land, they don't really take on that symbolism so very much anymore. At that time, watchmen are set up around the city, and those watchmen have their trumpets, and they have a job to do. Their job is to watch, and their job is to warn the people of accompanying disaster. And of course, when they go to war, well, they've got to have the trumpets, just like the cavalry has to have the trumpets, to know when to charge and to know when to retreat. Is it Numbers 31? No, good. Numbers 31:1 was the reference then from that passage. However, when Israel came to Jericho, after they had crossed the Jordan River and were ready to go around that city, they did not use the silver trumpets on this occasion. They used the shofar. In this occasion, Jericho, this I believe would be Joshua 6 verse 1, Jericho was straitly shut up because of the children of Israel. Nobody went out and nobody came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given into your hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and all the mighty men of valor. You're to surround the city, all your men of war, and to go around the city once. You are to do this for 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day you shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets." That is, with the ram's horns. Now, I don't know exactly why this was done. The silver trumpets could only be blown by the sons of Aaron, but they were presumably here. Most of the alarms in the Old Testament, as you'll come to them, are shofars, but not on this occasion. And it seems to maybe have something to do on this occasion with the fact that there would be 7 of them. They were going to compass the city 7 times. They were going to blow on the horns 7 times. They needed 7 horns to blow on them. And how many silver trumpets were there? 2. So there may be something in that led to the choice of the use of the shofar. But I think, for the most part, down through their history, the distinction between the one kind of instrument and another is not critical. I think it has far more to do with who's doing the fighting, what are the circumstances, is there a son of Aaron to blow the trumpet or not. But in most cases, the silver trumpets were preserved almost entirely for ceremonial. You get the feeling as you make your way on through the Bible that it was the shofar that became the dominant symbol that Israel carried into battle or in whatever else it was doing, with the exception of the ceremonial use. In 2 Chronicles chapter 15, they gathered themselves, and this is verse 10, they gathered themselves together at Jerusalem in the 3rd month in the 15th year of the reign of Asa. And they offered unto the Lord the same time the spoil that they had brought, 700 oxen, 7,000 sheep. And they entered into a covenant to seek the Lord their God of their fathers with all their heart and all their soul. that whoever would not seek the Lord God of Israel would be put to death, small or great, whether man or woman. In other words, this what they're saying here is God is the official God of this country. Our Constitution says Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. With Israel, God says you shall make a statute having to do with the establishment of a religion. It's a covenant between me and with you, and everybody is to follow this, or they're going to be put to death. And they swore unto the Lord with a loud voice, and with shouting, and with trumpets. And by the way, the silver trumpets are called chatzatzara. I think that's another example of the sounds imitating the instrument itself. They are not shofars, they are chatzatzara. But on this occasion, there was shouting with trumpets and with cornets, and the word for cornet is shofar. The word cornet, by the way, shofar in the Hebrew basically means curved horn. It doesn't specify ram's horn or anything. That just happens to be what the shofar was for the most part. But it's interesting that they translated in this case cornets, but it was both kinds of trumpets. So on this occasion, there's a swearing, a blowing of trumpets, both kinds of trumpets, and all Judah rejoiced at the oath, for they had sworn with their heart and sought him out with the whole desire, and he was found of them, and the Lord gave them rest all about. So you kind of have a mixed bag as you read through the law and the history of Israel, having to do with the silver trumpets, the chatzatzara as they're called, or the ram's horn, the shofar, and its use. But to an Israelite, the memorial of blowing of the trumpets would not have seemed any particular significance beyond the fact that it would have called to his mind this instrument as an alarm, as a warning, that it oftentimes had to do with war, but it also had to do with celebration. It had to do with all sorts of different things. So when you try to look at the Old Testament for typology connected with the Feast of Trumpets, you're left with an awfully generalized bag of things that you would think about and talk about. Now, as you go on beyond this, though, and you come to the prophets, the trumpet in question in the prophets is almost always the shofar. Now, when Israel thought of the feast of the blowing of trumpets, what would have come to their mind? Well, the natural thing to do is to begin making your way through some of the prophetic literature and see what we might find there. Some people don't think of the Psalms as prophetic literature, but they are. So if you turn back to Psalm 47, we'll talk about one of these examples. To the chief musician, a psalm for the sons of Korah, Psalm 47. Oh, clap your hands, all you people. Shout to the Lord with the voice of triumph. For the Lord is most high and terrible. He is a great king over all the earth. He shall subdue all the people under us and the nations under our feet. He shall choose our inheritance for us, the excellency of Jacob, whom he loves. God is gone up with a shout, with the Lord, with the sound of the trumpet. Now, remarkably, there's a presumption of the millennium in this passage. Did you notice it? He is a great king over all the earth. He shall subdue all the people under us, the nations under our feet. He shall choose our inheritance for us, the excellency of Jacob, whom he loved. This is actually millennial in tone. It actually looks toward the kingdom of God. It actually impresses upon one's mind that the kingdom of God sometime is coming. And along with it, God has gone up with a shout, the Lord with the sound of a trumpet. The typology of the trumpet in prophecy is connected with the day of the Lord. That is almost a given. If you're very familiar at all with the prophets, you'll realize that. In Psalm 81, in verse 1, to the chief musician upon Gittith, the psalm of Asaph, sing aloud to our God in strength. Make a joyful noise to the God of Jacob. Take a psalm and bring hither the timbrel and the pleasant harp with the psaltery. Blow up the trumpet in the new moon, in the time appointed, on our solemn feast day. Now, this is the Feast of Trumpets. It's the only festival, in fact, that occurs on the new moon. Now, there's one thing that some people have looked at, is this new moon in the time appointed. The Hebrew word here for appointed is fullness. And some have presumed from this that what this is talking about is the full moon festival. Well, the full moon festival it could either be Passover or it could be the Feast of Tabernacles. There's no way of knowing which one it is. But the wording of it is really kind of strange if that is the intent of the psalmist in this case. But the actual fact is that what it says is blow up the trumpet in the new moon. in the fullness of time. And what is interesting about the Feast of Trumpets in that regard is it comes at the fullness of the year. In other words, the year has been filled out, and the year is over, and then we blow up the trumpet in the new moon, in the fullness, at the time appointed, and that is, I think, what is suggested here. So this particular psalm is aiming at the Feast of Trumpets, in my opinion. Then, passing on down to Isaiah chapter 27 and verse 12. Isaiah 27 and verse 12. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall beat off from the channel of the river of the stream of Egypt. Now, to beat off is to thresh. You know, you beat the grain to beat off the grain. He shall beat off from the channel of the river unto the stream of Egypt, and you shall be gathered one by one, O ye children of Israel. Now, before I go on, let me just sort of explain what he's talking about here. He's talking about how God's going to come through and hit the grain and shake and knock out the little individual pieces of grain. And he says, I'm going to begin gathering you back. This is a time when Israel has been scattered, and God is going to bring them back. It shall come to pass in that day that the great trumpet shall be blown. And they will come who are ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and the outcasts in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mountain at Jerusalem. Now, I can't take the time today. It's a really long and involved study. But this whole segment around Isaiah, and really in a way that comes all the way from the beginning of Isaiah to this time, has to do with, historically, it deals with the time of Israel leading up to their captivity. And it looks beyond their captivity to a return from that captivity. But repeatedly in this section, you have implications or indications of the day of the Lord, of the return of Christ, the establishment of the kingdom of God. There are all kinds of millennial references from the 2nd chapter of Isaiah to the 11th chapter of Isaiah and so forth. And so you have this strange duality of a prophecy that has to do with Isaiah's own day and the times that were lying just ahead of them there, on the one hand. But at the same time, you have all these overtones in there, and they are intentional, that look way down to the end time, to the return of Christ and the establishment of Israel at that time. Now, what I thought was interesting about this is, it says, it shall come to pass in that day that the great trumpet shall be blown. And they will come who are ready to perish in the land of Assyria and the outcasts and so forth, and are all going to finally be brought back to Israel at that time. What do you suppose it means by the great trumpet? Now, it's tempting when you read something like that to think of the 7th trumpet of Revelation, to think of the last trumpet that involves the resurrection, but probably not. There are some numerous references, as I said, all the way to the kingdom through this section, but the great shofar, that is the great trumpet which he's talking about here, is probably a reference to Leviticus 25. And I'll take you back there just for a moment to underline what I'm saying. In Leviticus 25 and verse 8 it says this, you shall number 7 Sabbaths of years unto you. Now, you all know about the Sabbath of the land Sabbath. That you farm your land for 6 years, the 7th year it lies fallow, right? And then you do that again, you work it for 6 years, and the 7th year it lies fallow, and so forth, through a cycle of 49 years. Then you number 7 Sabbaths of years unto you, 7 times 7 years, 49 years, the space of 7 Sabbaths of years, and you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound in the 10th day of the 7th month, in the day of atonement. You make the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound. Remember now, we have a trumpet on every single holiday anyway. But this great trumpet that is blown on the Day of Atonement is something else entirely. It's not just every Day of Atonement, but a particular Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement that follows the end of the 49th year. He says, you shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you. You shall return every man to his possession, and every man to his own family. Now, having understood what the Jubilee is all about, that everybody's to go back home, everybody gets their land back, all the debts are canceled, every man who is bound bond is now free. Then if you go back and look again at Isaiah 27 and verse 12, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall thresh from the channel of the river to the stream of Egypt, and you shall be gathered one by one, you children of Israel. And it shall come to pass in that day the great trumpet shall be blown. And they shall come who are ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and the outcasts in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mountain at Jerusalem. There's something about this that it really seems that for God to set Israel free, it really should be at the beginning of a Jubilee year if he follows his own pattern. For if you had fallen into debt in Israel of old and had not been able to pay, they would have put you up on the auction block and sold you off to the highest bidder. And the money would have gone to pay your debt, and you would have gone off to pay your debt to whoever bought you by involuntary servitude for some little period of time. You'd have harvested his grapes and stomped them grapes, and you'd have done whatever it was that man needed done until the time of your release. But the law requires the release of the captives. So, when God sold Israel into captivity, there will come a day when by his law they are entitled to be released. And the time of that entitlement is at the end of 50 years, the beginning of the 50th year, when the trumpet of the Jubilee is blown, which I think he is talking about in Isaiah 27, when he calls it the great trumpet. Now another one is found in Jeremiah chapter 4. Jeremiah chapter 4. Declare you in Judah and publish in Jerusalem and say, blow you the trumpet in the land. Cry, gather together and say, assemble yourselves, and let us go to the defense cities. Set up the standard toward Zion. Retire, don't wait, for I am going to bring evil from the north and a great destruction. Now, here is a prophecy that has to do with times of the end. And what's striking about this also is that where does the destruction come from? The north. You go read Daniel's prophecy, and you find in the 11th chapter that at the time of the end, the king of the south will push at the king of the north, and the king of the north shall come after him like a whirlwind. He'll come into the land. He'll overflow the whole area. The lands just across the Jordan will escape. Egypt, he'll go all the way to the border of Ethiopia, but Egypt, Libya, and all these people will not escape. He will come right into the glorious land. And what he is saying is simply this in Daniel, that out of the north is coming this great destruction right at the time of the end. And Jeremiah says that at this time I'm going to bring evil upon you from the north and a great destruction. The lion has come up from his thicket. The destroyer of the Gentiles is on his way. He's gone forth from his place to make your land desolate. Your cities shall be laid waste without an inhabitant. For this, gird yourself with sackcloth, lament and howl, for the fierce anger of the Lord is not turned back from us. It shall come to pass at that day, saith the Lord, that the heart of the king shall perish, and the heart of the princes, and the priests shall be astonished, and the prophets shall wonder. Now, what we're reading about here seems rather different from that of Isaiah, doesn't it? The one in Isaiah, the great trumpet is blown, and God threshes the wheat and brings his people back grain by grain to restore them back into the land. The trumpet that is blown on this occasion is an alarm of war because of a destroyer coming down from the north, and it really seems, this trumpet does, to usher in the day of the Lord, the day of God's wrath. And in fact, I won't be doing it today by any stretch of the imagination, but you will find as you study the New Testament imagery of all this, the connection between that last trumpet and the day of the Lord and the day of God's wrath. All these things just start rolling right in together when you put it together. Unfortunately, as you read through the Old Testament prophets, you may be left scratching your head and wondering which trumpet is which, and how do I connect this to the Feast of Trumpets? Well, we know we can put together the idea of the Jubilee with the great trumpet being sounded on the Day of Atonement. But yet we've got another trumpet that is sounded. From the Psalms we know that it was the day of the new moon, the day of the solemn feast, which is the one festival that falls on the first down on the new moon that we blow the trumpet. What might that particular trumpet point to? What might it make us think about? Continuing a little later in this same chapter of Jeremiah, he says, your way and your doings have procured these things to you. This is your wickedness, and it's bitter, because it reaches into your heart. Then the prophet cries, my bowels, I am pained at my very heart. My heart makes a noise in me. I can't hold my peace. Because you have heard, O my soul, the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. The sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. Destruction upon destruction is cried, for the whole land is spoiled. Suddenly my tents are spoiled, my curtains in a moment. How long shall I see the standard? How long will I hear the sound of the trumpet? For my people is foolish. They have not known me. They are sottish children. They have no understanding. They are wise to do evil, but to do good they have no knowledge. Boy, when you read this stuff, you realize that for people who are in this category, now this frame of mind, the trumpet, the sound of war, well, his initial description of it was, it loosens your bowels. It's not something you want to hear. It's dreadful. It's frightening. He says, I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled. I saw the hills were jumping lightly. And behold, and there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens had fled. Why? Because the armies are rolling down on us, and there's been a trumpet, an alarm of war that's been sounded. And here they come. Well, obviously, the events being described here are before that great trumpet. They are at the sounding of an earlier trumpet, which is not the great trumpet of the Jubilee to bring God's people back and to assemble them, but rather the trumpet that warns of destruction and of their scattering is going to take place. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord and by his fierce anger. There are a lot of other references, and you could take your own concordance and work your way through them, but one that's familiar to us is Ezekiel 33. Again, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, O son of man, speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, when I bring the sword upon a land, if the people of the land take a man of their coast and set him up for their watchman, if when he sees the sword come upon the land, he blow the trumpet and warn the people, then whoever hears the sound of the trumpet and takes not warning, if the sword come and take him away, his blood will be upon his own head. He heard the sound of the trumpet, he did not take warning, his blood is upon him. But he that takes warning, well, he'll deliver his soul. But if the watchmen see the sword come and blow not the trumpet, and the people are not warned, if the sword come and take any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity. But his blood I will require at the watchman's hand. Now, I don't think any of us would like to suggest that we are God's watchmen or are placed in the position of God's watchmen. But the symbolism of this is not that hard to figure. And that is that the trumpet is used in this way as a warning of what's coming down on your heads if something doesn't change. And I really think that any man, whether he's be the appointed watchman or whether he's just up on the wall at midnight just to get a little fresh air before he goes to bed and he sees it, any one of us who sees what's happening and does not take the opportunity to warn or to caution or to say or to speak, we are, I think, in a rather dangerous position from that particular passage of Scripture. And I think the Feast of Trumpets might cause us to think back that there is a responsibility upon any one of us who sees the danger coming, who sees what could happen, that if we don't take in hand, if we don't do our job, if we don't give a warning, then we are going to be held in some degree responsible for what takes place in those circumstances. Now, the final scripture I want to take you to is Joel, the 2nd chapter. Because it's in Joel, the 2nd chapter, that much of this, I think, really begins to come together. It starts off, the 2nd chapter of Joel does, with the words, blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord comes. It is near at hand. Now, for a generation, I guess, we have looked at this passage of Scripture, and we have made the connection between the Feast of Trumpets and the day of the Lord. I don't know how easy it would be to make the connection between the Feast of Trumpets and the day of the Lord if you had nothing but the Old Testament to go by. And remember, we're talking about this from a perspective of a Jew before the birth of Christ, who reads the Scriptures, keeps the Feast of Trumpets, and tries to grasp the typology or the symbolism in prophecy from this. Would we make the connection as we got ready to observe the new year and the blowing of trumpets and the realization that 7 of them were behind us, and now this trumpet is blown? With the realization, if we were, let's say we were a rabbi and a very careful student of the Scriptures, with the realization that the great trumpet of the Jubilee that takes place 10 days later than this particular passage of Scripture, that this might have to do with something that came before it. Frankly, I don't think I would have come to that. I don't think I would have grasped it. And one of the reasons why I don't think I would have grasped it is because, for the most part, Israel never really saw what was coming. The prophets would come and the prophets would tell them, And they would listen to him, and he was like somebody either playing on a musical instrument that it was lovely to hear, and he had a good voice, and we liked listening to him, but don't pay any attention to him. He doesn't know. Nutty Elijah is here. Nutty Isaiah is here. Nutty Ezekiel is here. Don't pay any attention to him. And that was the pattern that they followed, and probably that you and I in there, we'd have followed right along with them. Right? Chances are that we wouldn't have been able to see any further than they saw. And yet here it sits, right in the middle of all this. Whereas that when you come to the New Testament, when Christ's Olivet prophecy is laid in here, when the revelation that is given to John is laid in here, all of a sudden you come to a clear realization that when Joel says, blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain, the day of the Lord comes. There is a coming day of the Lord, a time of God's wrath. It will be again afterward. It's a time unique in all of history. There's to be a day of darkness, thick darkness, clouds on the mountains. A day when the sun, you cannot even see the sun because of the dust and the clouds that are in the air. A time when the whole earth is darkened because of it. A time of earthquakes. A time of men's hearts failing them for fear. It's the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord is ushered in by a trumpet. It's a time of judgment. What are we to make of it? Well, Joel, the typology or the symbolism in Joel is clear. He says it's a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness like the morning spread on the mountains. A great people, a strong. There has never been the like before it, and there'll never be anybody again like it to the years of many generations. A fire devours before them. Behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them it's like a desolate wilderness, and nothing shall escape them. You know, does any of this stuff ring any bells with you? If you're a first century BC Jew, probably not. Probably not. And yet you ought to have a little thrill of fear when you read it, realizing that this is something out there, something ahead of us, something we have to look forward to with some dread as we approach the end time as to what may happen. If you were to read this with what else you know about the Old Testament, what direction would you presume that these armies would be coming from? The north, right? From what we read in Jeremiah and what we see in Daniel about the king of the north. He then goes on to say, the appearance of them is like the appearance of horses. They run like horsemen. Like the noise of chariots on the tops of the mountains shall they leap. Like the noise of a flame of fire that devours the stubble. A strong people in battle array. Before their face the people shall be much pained. All faces shall gather blackness. They shall run like mighty men. They climb the wall like men of war. They march every one on his ways. They don't break their ranks. They are disciplined, this army. They shall one thrust another, and shall walk every one in his path. And when they fall upon the sword, they're not even wounded. They're protected by whatever is going on. These people are powerful. A very striking, disciplined army. It's funny how many people, as they look down toward the end time, want to assume that this terrible, destroying army is an Arabic or Islamic power. It just doesn't fit. It just doesn't fit. This is an army that is probably more disciplined than any that has come before. In ranks. Don't break ranks. They're very careful in the way they go about doing their business, and their business is violence. And they're very good at it. He says, they shall run to and fro in the city. They shall run upon the wall. They climb up the houses. They enter in the windows like a thief. The earth quakes before them. The heavens tremble. The sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. And the Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for his camp is very great. And folks, his army at this moment in time is not Israel. It's that army that's invading Israel he calls his army. He is strong that executes his word, for the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can abide it? Therefore turn even to me with all your heart, and with fasting, and with weeping, and with mourning, and rend your heart, and not your garments. And if I'm an Israeli, first century Israeli looking at that, I'd say to myself, fasting? What comes after the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the time when we fast? First of all, we have this trumpet that is blown. That's the day of the Lord. Now he says, turn with all your heart. with fasting and weeping and mourning, and rend your heart and not your garments, and turn to the Lord your God. For he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and repents of the evil. Who knows if he will return and repent and leave a blessing behind him, even a meat offering and a drink offering to the Lord your God. Blow the trumpet in Zion and sanctify a fast. When do you blow the trumpet and sanctify a fast? On the 10th day of the 7th month. So you blow a trumpet, the invading armies are coming, everybody is scared to death. And they are a violent, overflowing army. 10 days later, you blow the trumpet on the Day of Atonement and declare a fast. You know, it's something that if I were thoughtful and I prayed a lot, that God might help me to come to see even before Christ came, even before the New Testament, even before Paul, before the Olivet prophecy, and before John and his prophecies. You know what else is interesting about this? In the same chapter, down in verse 28, it shall come to pass afterward, I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. And upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my Spirit. Where else have you heard that? Is that familiar to you? We just went over it a week ago. Acts 2, the 2nd chapter of Acts. Peter, on the day of Pentecost, comes right back to this prophecy and says this is looking forward to the day of the Lord and the coming of Jesus Christ. Well, I don't think we've given enough attention to the typology of the Old Testament, the symbolism of these holy days at that time. I think we really should study these things more carefully. It's almost impossible to come from the Old Testament alone to a full grasp of the symbolism of these days. Trumpets is especially elusive. But what is dramatic beyond belief is once Christ enters the picture, once Christology is overlaid over these holy days, including the Feast of Trumpets, all kinds of things start coming clear. And the funny thing to me about this is I look at the world today and I see hardly any Christian people who bother observing these festivals. And yet these festivals are more significant for Christians than they ever were for Jews, if we just had the eyes to see it.